Well, thank you for coming and welcome to our third panel. I'm Harry Surden. I'm a law professor at the University of Colorado Law School in Boulder, where it is currently snowing 10 inches or more. So for that reason and many other reasons, I'm very happy to be here at Stanford, a place I always enjoy visiting and a favorite place of mine. So I thank you for having me. Today I have the pleasure of moderating this panel concerning a very interesting paper, Do Robots Dream of Electric Laws? An Experiment in the Law as Algorithm. And joining me today are two of the paper's authors. They both have very distinguished backgrounds, so I won't go over that, but I suggest you can look at their bios in the program online. But I will briefly introduce them. To my left, I have Woody Hartzog, professor of law at Stanford University's Cumberland School of Law. And to his left, we have Professor Greg Conti, who's a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at West Point. So this paper is on the general topic of taking laws that have been created for activities in the physical world and implementing them on computer systems, translating the logic of the legislation and in a way that the computer can understand, and in such a way that the computer may be able to make automated or partially automated prima facie assessments as to conformance or non-conformance with the law. This might seem something of the future, but it's actually becoming increasingly more important because our lives are increasingly interacting through electronically mediated environments online and also with objects such as autonomous vehicles and objects that have electronic sensors in them. And increasingly it's becoming important that these objects be able to interact with the laws that govern the objects themselves. So the general structure of this panel will be a presentation by the authors. I will follow up with some commentary of my own. We'll have a panel discussion and then open it up to the audience for your questions. And without further ado, let me turn it over to the authors for their presentation.
Hi, and thanks for the opportunity to come here today. This is really, really exciting. So Lisa Shea wasn't able to join us today, nor John Nelson, but I think we've got a really neat interdisciplinary team here covering computer science, the law, electrical engineering, and literature ethics and privacy backgrounds. In particular, I don't think we have many electrical engineers in the audience, but when you want to do a study or an experiment on, hey, we need data from cars, and your member of your team says, oh, I already do that. As a hobby, I have this box, I hook it up to my car, and I pull data out of my car so I can analyze it. I can get data out of any car you want. That's the power of having an electrical engineer on your team. That's what they do for a hobby. So no strangers to disclaimers. Woody and I are here as free citizens and not the representatives of any government. For fun, we like to translate this into different languages using Google Translate, including Klingon, and see if the audience notices. Okay, Woody.
So we presented a paper last year that was called Confronting Automated Law Enforcement, and it gets at the problem of the various costs and issues when you decide to turn over enforcement of the law to a computer and basically take humans in some instance out of the loop, whatever the loop refers to. And for this year, what we wanted to do is take that a little further because we got to talking about it and said, okay, well, if there are going to be increasing pressures, both monetary and otherwise, to automate law enforcement, and because that's now become technically feasible, there are also going to be automated attempts at compliance. In either of those instances, either enforcing the law or complying with the law in an automated way, someone's going to have to take that law and convert it into an algorithm. And that's what we wanted to do with the following experiment that Greg's going to talk about for a little while is get into the various complications that can happen and the decisions that have to be made when you take a law that is relatively determinate. I was very pleased that Harry was going to be commenting on our paper because he wrote a wonderful paper called the Variable Determinacy Thesis, and I recommend it to everyone, and we borrowed that as a framework. Laws that are typically amenable to being automated are those that are relatively determinate. That is, they are predictable because there's little room for choice in any given model. And we wanted to demonstrate the difficulty in taking what is seemingly a relatively determinate law, a speeding law, which is you're either speeding or you're not speeding, and flesh that out and say, well, what happens when we actually take this relatively simple law and try to convert it into an algorithm? And the point of what we're trying to get into all of this is there are a lot of judgments that have to be made, and if you don't provide those specifications in a collaborative group, then the designers are going to fill in the blanks themselves. And with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
And the result can be scary. And I just wanted to share one cautionary tale. I'm facing this in my workplace now. In my workplace, we have mandatory drug testing, and the policy changed from about once a year we'd have to do it to a new policy of 4 to 5% of the workforce weekly. And that's all fine, and I understand that. But also the policy says you must use this automated compliance program to tell who should be tagged to do these things. And statistical anomalies that are like number of atoms in the universe kind of probabilities are occurring. People are getting it 3-4 weeks in a row. And you're getting into, and the person in charge says, well, I've been told to use this compliance program. I'm not empowered to override it. And we have to get this right. Something is, I can tell you right now, something is absolutely wrong with that, because we're on glide path to do 1,200% of the workforce this year. And somewhere there's a warehouse of test samples that will never be evaluated. So it's nonsense, but it's automation-driven nonsense. So the experiment. We had 50 programmers. They're upper-level computer science and information technology students. This is at least their third programming course. They took part in an experiment where we gave them driving data captured from a black box pulled by Lisa Shea from a commuter automobile. It was about 69 minutes of data, and the black box has a lot more information, but we pulled out time and speed. And then we also carefully recorded the speed limits at different points in time. So we gave that to the programmers as data, and the paper also highlights the location. So we made that data available if someone else wants to experiment it. Those comma-separated value sheets are available, or data sets are available online. And we divided up into 3 groups. One group was the letter of the law, right? And you should be scared, okay? Because the letter of the law is pretty ugly, particularly when you can automate it. And then B was the intent of the law in the mind of the programmer. And C, essentially the intent of the law, by Woody and I trying to craft a specification to constrain many of those decisions. So a couple of things came out of it, and I'd say the key takeaway is there are a surprising number of degrees of freedom, even when laws feel very precise, very crisp. Thou shalt not speed over this speed limit. Well, there's a lot of issues being raised when you try and translate that analog law into algorithm. And that's what we're getting at. So here's a picture of the data set, and it shows just the samples of speed over time. And I'll just highlight one region. That's 55 miles an hour, approximately. Those bars are the speed limits for those points in time. And the red box is when the driver put on her cruise control. And contrary to what you think, your car doesn't lock on to exactly 55 miles an hour. It fluctuates up and down. It does not brake. At least in this car, it only controls the throttle. So you can see it was hilly terrain, and there's definitely exceeding even 60 miles an hour. It took 3 samples per second. And how those samples are treated in the algorithm made a huge difference on the number of mock tickets that were issued. That was the metric that the programmers were trying to evaluate. So there were sample, 3 times per second. There are other questions. How do you embed the tolerance or the grace that law enforcement officers don't necessarily pull you over at 0.001 miles per hour above the speed limit? But a computer program, smart highway program, has that ability within certain margins of error. How should that be coded? So we called those values tolerance, and the actual speed limit and the enforced speed limit. And here you can see these two people are true violations. Their A and C are both above the speed limit. And B occurred at a point in time was above the actual speed limit and below the enforced speed limit. And then there are other metrics that come into play. Does it matter how much time you have between offenses? How many samples do you need for there to be an offense? Right now, a law enforcement officer with a radar gun can just point the radar gun, bink, get one sample, you get a ticket. The friction in the system, though, however, means you're not going to get 3 tickets a second for 45 seconds that you're over. And I have to say, we can't cover the whole paper today. We only have 15 minutes. But what I'd like to do is kind of entice you to give you highlights of it, or some of the highlights, and then encourage you to go back and look at the full paper. Another aspect that we got at is tolerance isn't necessarily one fixed value. It's different than if you're driving 15 miles an hour over a speed limit in a 10-mile-an-hour school zone or something, and 10 miles an hour over the speed limit in a 65. So you have to take into account variable tolerances, perhaps. And like I said, we had 3 groups. So this is the tolerances when the programmers had to fill in the values based on their own. This is the range of values. Some of them gave 20 miles an hour for free, right? You could drive up to 20 miles an hour over, and then went all the way down to 3 or 4 miles an hour. So this is the whole distribution of those values. The letter of the law group entirely said no grace at all. You cross the speed limit, you get a ticket. And then in our design specification, we had 2 tiers. We said less than or equal to 30 miles an hour, you get 5 miles an hour free, and 10 miles an hour for free if you're in a zone that's above 30 miles an hour. Other interesting things came up, such as notice. Does the driver know? Is this happening without the driver's knowledge? Is there a feedback loop to the driver? If you think of a red light camera, maybe it flashes and you're like, hey, did I get a ticket? Or maybe it doesn't. And maybe you get something 3 months or 3 weeks later in the mail. So there's an assumption of, do you know what the speed is? Or are you getting feedback? And one of the really great aspects of it, and here the person, if you do receive notice, then maybe you have a choice. You can go down path A or path B. One of the programmers came up with the idea of creating a deceleration function. You've received notice, in her case that you got a ticket. It expects you to immediately start decelerating, and if you don't, you'll continue to get tickets. That was the way she coded the algorithm, but I thought it was very nice. So that requires this kind of upper and lower bounds on deceleration, because you don't want someone to stand on the brakes, go skidding sideways down the highway either. So there's this kind of band of acceptable parameters. Error is very significant. No sensor is perfect. No clock is perfect. And I tend to think each one of those samples, it had error in terms of speed and in time. And we cover that in more detail in the paper. And so there's error in every single sample. And it can vary over time. So here we have a small error on the left, and a little while later, maybe due to weather or temperature, a little less accuracy. So this is just kind of a highlight of the results, but these two lines show 1 ticket per sample, and then tolerance, right? So how many mock tickets were issued, how many samples, on the blue line, how many samples were above the speed limit? And then grace, if you give them 1 mile an hour over for free, 2, 3, 4. And you can see that it starts out at 932 samples were above the speed limit. We would have our driver's licenses in a kind of 3 strikes you're out kind of model for about 5 minutes before they would be lost in that regime. And then the second one, the red line, shows 1 ticket per 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes in between tickets, so you had to have at least 5 minutes. And then one of the cheeky ones said, well, if you give me a ticket, I'll just do 56 miles an hour, get my ticket, and then for 4 minutes and 59 seconds, I'm going to find out what the top speed of my car is.
Right.
So, and that gets into wargaming the algorithms. There could be new paradigms for punishment. We know exactly what people are doing now. Not just one sample of a police officer happens to be staying there, but we can calculate over time, say in a smart highway sample, or smart highway analogy. And you think of, this is violation, but over lunch we were talking about, what about insurance? You could have proportional insurance. Like when you go into those zones, your insurance goes up, and if you're down below, your insurance goes down. It could change over time. And which may be what's going on with those little boxes people sign up for. Okay, Woody.
So what are the implications of this study? One of the things that we wanted to try to find were some problem areas. We wanted to identify generally some problem areas that we noticed, and we identified 4, though these are certainly not exhaustive. The first is culpability. What kind of laws can you automate? If a law requires some kind of culpability or mental state, chances are that's off the board for automation right now, because we simply don't have the inputs to make that kind of determination as to fault or wrongfulness under the circumstances. Another problem area is the objectivity of the wrongful conduct. So it's one thing to say, well, if you're traveling at a certain speed, then that's you either are or you aren't. Whereas if you're driving recklessly and when there is inclement weather, which are some traffic rules, then that's not something that really is going to be amenable to be automated, at least not right now. Identification. You've got to make sure that you can identify the wrongdoer if you're going to punish the wrongdoer in some kind of way. So you've got to make sure that you've got some kind of automated way to verify identity, which brings into discussions of biometrics, which has its own problems. And finally, accessibility. There are only, despite concerns of living in a surveillance society, there are still things that inputs of information that are not entirely available to us, at least not readily available. And so you've got to beforehand determine what kind of information is accessible to you in order to, at least readily accessible to you, in order to automate it. There are a few other concerns. Coding the law, in our opinion, potentially requires lawmaking or rulemaking authority because of the number of judgments that go into some kind of automation. And so if you're going to basically say, okay, so now we're going to automate speeding enforcement here, and you contract out to a third-party vendor, I think that we raise concerns about the number of judgments that go into that, and so.
Yeah, a surprising number of degrees of freedom.
Right.
Far more than you'd think. I mean, there's all sorts of different minor details that in some make a huge difference in the end result.
Right. Compliance programs are probably needed. This is a very good opportunity for interdisciplinary groups to work together, lawyers, designers, engineers, to work towards basically saying, okay, this robot is not going to break X law. Of course, we identify from the outset, no model is going to be perfect. All you have to do is make it good enough, but the question then is, of course, what is good enough? You have to watch out for second and third order effects. So what's the effect on traffic if you automate the law? There are going to be lots of perhaps unintended consequences. And finally, we want to address the social cost of automating both enforcement and compliance. We have concerns that vulnerable populations will be disparately affected by this. And we also, and I think one of the most interesting aspects of the paper is afterwards we polled all of the designers as to whether they would want to drive on the roads that are being governed by the algorithms that they created. And the answer was almost uniformly no. Even in the specification group, there was a general sense that nobody wanted to drive on these roads. And curiously, the only person that did said that they would, but only if she could build in a back door for herself to circumvent the laws. So.
Yeah. And that, yeah, that's good. With that, yes.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that presentation. I'm just going to comment on that, just a couple of points. So first of all, let me start out by saying I really like this paper. I thought it was extremely interesting, raised a lot of novel points that I've not seen raised. And what really struck me, I think, was the focus on a novel series of points of indeterminacy in the law that really haven't been recognized before in implementing laws. And And an important point is how seemingly minor implementation details in translating a law into a technical implementation of even a straightforward law could potentially result in a diametrically opposite legal outcome, right? And I think that just strikes us as all a little bit problematic and something that needs a little more attention. And in particular, I'm going to return to your example of clustering, which I thought was a great example. So that was the idea that, in the pre-electronic world, if you're trying to test somebody's speed, a police officer might have only enough resources to take one sample over a given stretch of road of the speed, say a 5-mile stretch. But now, due to automation, you could potentially get 5, 10, 20 speed samples over a given road length. So it raises sort of an important question that's really ambiguous in the law today. If you have 5 different samples of a car speeding over a given stretch of road, is that 5 separate violations, or is it one violation and continuous measurement of that same violation? We might have our opinions on that, but it's certainly an ambiguity that exists in the law today that probably needs to be clarified. And the reason I like this example and some of the other ones, because it reminds me of some earlier observations, an important area of legal scholarship from the 1980s about indeterminacy. And I'll just mention a favorite piece of scholarship of mine by Stanford Law School's own Mark Kelman, which raised an analogous point that was very profound in the criminal context. There's a paper called Interpretive Construction in the Substantive Criminal Law. It's a very influential article because it showed how seemingly arbitrary details in the criminal context can lead to diametrically opposite outcomes on the issue of guilt or innocence of serious crimes like murder. So just to give you an example, he emphasized, say you have premeditated murder, and premeditated murder requires an act of planning for the murder. Well, it turns out that a seemingly inconsequential detail, such as the time frame that the judge adopts for the case, can be dispositive on the issue of guilt or innocence one way or the other. So if the judge adopts a narrow time frame for the same set of facts, a certain act could be seen as premeditated, even if it occurred a day earlier. If the judge adopts a wider time frame, that could be seen as the continuous act, and it could be seen as a lesser offense, like a heat of passion type of homicide. So this, I think, raises a similar point in how seemingly innocent or seemingly not unconsequential implementation details when it comes to translating law can lead to really significant outcomes in how the law is assessed. So I really liked it for that reason. The second point I'll make, and the other reason I liked it, is it highlights how much needs to be done and how much we should be paying attention to this before we start implementing these laws in computer code. So the vast majority of the scenarios where we see today, and there aren't many, involve laws that have been created by legislatures for the ordinary non-electronic context that are being translated for the electronic context. And that's potentially problematic because the lawmakers have not thought about the whole process. So just to give you my favorite example, which I write about a lot, TurboTax. Right? So TurboTax involves a computerized representation of the personal income tax code. Intuit, the maker of TurboTax, has become the default arbiter of our personal income tax code. They're making all sorts of judgments and interpretations that are being de facto accepted by the Internal Revenue Service. They're making a lot of judgments in there on how they translate the portion of the personal income tax code that they implement the logic in computer code that are going underneath the radar and being made by a third party outside of transparency or supervision. So there's a similar problem that you identify, and this is just a general problem that we need to confront in terms of the issue of translating laws into the computer context. And I think I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but one of the reasons, or one of the approaches, I believe, is that lawmakers have to think about the way in which laws are going to be implemented and be involved in the process, and also actually deliberately architect laws for the electronic context. Not to say that lawmakers should be writing the code themselves, but they need to think about the process and how important the implementation is. The job doesn't end in terms of just writing the law. That's actually a very optimistic position, because this is so far off the radar of most lawmakers that that's the 20-year time frame. Most lawmakers, in my opinion, that I've spoken to aren't even aware in any meaningful way that the actual laws are being translated into computer form today. But it is actually happening. All right, so I'd love to follow up with the panel on a couple of questions in this really interesting paper. You alluded at a problem which I think is really important, which is the problem of automation and perfect enforcement. Right? So once you start embedding laws in technological systems, there's at least the possibility that you can have perfect monitoring of violations and perfect enforcement through technological systems. And there's some that have argued that there are actually values, implicit values, in imperfect enforcement. There's some good to the fact of this, what you call friction, that whoever is doing the monitoring can't always monitor you in today's non-technical world and can't always stop you from violating the law in a way that they can. So I want to hear your thoughts on imperfect enforcement and whether there are values there.
Sure. I think that there are absolute values in imperfect enforcement, mainly because it allows for discretion, which gives us some kind of flexibility. I don't think that the laws, as they were drafted, anyone even contemplated perfect enforcement. And what's even potentially more problematic than perfect enforcement might be perfect prevention, which not even allowing you to get to that point. And we kind of try to highlight that in this paper and the other paper. And so I think that it would be wise to proceed with caution anytime someone proposes a perfect enforcement system, as we've actually seen with the red light cameras, which make a really good example, because now we're seeing some backlash in various cities where the citizens have said, enough of this. Like, this is, if I didn't run the red light, I would have been rear-ended, and without any kind of an appeal system that's easy to do, sometimes it's burdensome, then it results in this disconnect between what we perceive to be the law. Because I think that if you measured everyone and they said, do you think stoplight cameras are good and that most people should stop when there's a red light, then everyone would say, well, sure, of course. But without any kind of flexibility, I think that we get, it becomes counterproductive. And I'll defer to Greg on.
I think we all have examples of driving that we've driven on highways where there are cameras and you pass the signs. And I tend to drive from Maryland, Washington, D.C. up to New York, and I see more and more signs each time I go. And frankly, that was the motivation, because I do not want to live I don't want to drive on that highway. And I think bureaucracies left to their own devices are dangerous. And nor do I want to live in a Skinner box, because kind of that's what we're talking about. Maybe not perfect enforcement, but below that is I only get shocked half the time, or 1 out of 10 times, instead of 1 out of 2,000 times, or whatever. And I don't think the laws were designed that way. I think it can damage society, because there's this spirit that's in our people that we can beat out of them with enough shocks and too tight law enforcement. I see it with the cadets, actually. Sometimes with the cadets, it takes a certain type of personality that does a risk analysis, that's willing to take on some risk to have some gain. And if you just constantly beat them down, I think it's bad for society in general.
Great. I think it's a really interesting point. So you've identified some points of uncertainty or indeterminacy where an implementation detail can lead to a diametrically opposite legal outcome. And it seems like our system is not really equipped to handle that today. Can you expand a little bit more on some ideas or suggestions that we can have in the legislative and implementation process going forward that might improve this?
One of the things that Greg and I and the team kicked around is the idea of creating some kind of either committee or organization, a standard-setting organization, that basically creates a dual set of laws, and this has been experimented a little bit in the past, that there's the law that when you have kind of one sample, so when I catch you speeding one time, and I'm a human, then you'll get a ticket, or there's the machine-readable version of that law, which might actually reflect something different, and so that's where we could get into clustering, for example, saying, well, if you drove over 10 miles an hour for a period of more than 30 seconds or a minute, then we'll give you a ticket. And that would look different than the original law, but accomplish, hopefully, the same goal, which is people won't speed anymore. And, of course, that gets back to your other point, which is with perfect enforcement, of course, a law doesn't have to be perfectly enforced to be effective. It just has to be at societally acceptable levels. And so, there are some examples of standard-setting organizations that could do this, and they could be multidisciplinary. They would involve, attorneys and engineers and computer scientists and other policymakers and stakeholders. And so that's one idea, and I'll defer to Greg.
Well, I think including the idea of transparency in the process, right? So as we build these algorithms, we've learned a lot from open source software, particularly the cryptography. The algorithm the key is the strength. The algorithm can be public. And if we do this, I think we should make this code transparent, leave it open to public examination so people know what's going on. That brings on risk because there's going to be this game of one-upsmanship as people look at the code and go, oh, it gives me 29 seconds of grace after I get a ticket, so I'm going to drive 179 miles an hour. But that's the type of thing that we can tease out, those problem areas we can tease out as we move forward if it's transparent. Otherwise, it's just this box that gives you shocks on occasion.
Great. So one final question before I open it up to the audience here is it occurs to me that we have these problems today in the pre-electronic world in terms of implementation. Today, the law is being implemented, but by people and processes and institutions, and they too are making implementation decisions that are left open to judgment, which could have differing outcomes. So I gave the one example of the court system, but we also have examples of under-enforcement of laws, laws on the books that are known to be under-enforced. We have prosecutorial discretion in the criminal world. There's contract under-enforcement. In the contract world, we have a provision that's there and under-enforced. So I guess the question is this anything new? Is it then what we've already experienced? Can we learn from the institutions or processes that we already have to deal with this problem? Is it exacerbated by technology?
That's an excellent question. I think that it probably forces us to get to the question sooner. I think that there's always been an opportunity for discretion, and that's been both good and bad, of course. You could also argue that it's very good to take away discretion because there are some bad things that can come with discretion. And if you have a computer that just basically enforces the law as it's asked to, then it doesn't care. And it doesn't make a lot of biased decisions. And so I think we can look to that. We're going to have to decide whether we want to. I think the real question is what's new about this is we systematize it, right? So it's one thing for an individual police officer to exercise his or her discretion about a particular event. But when you take an enforcement system and you encode it, then all of a sudden all of that bias that you have, which of course is simply the product of human judgment anyway, then becomes systematized. And so I do think that this is something new in that sense that I don't know, and I would be actually open to anyone that has suggestions about what we can draw from to make that a transition, if we want to make that transition, how to make it smooth.
It's just concerning because right now I like having human, I know there's bias, there's dangerous bias, but I in general, having a human moderating kind of decision-making is, I think, better than some of the other options. But they're just the frictionless aspects of this, that we can just process this continuously over time without any judgment, or really the judgment's been embedded in the law. And without oversight, that's really a serious problem.
Right, so it sounds like some of the suggestions you've made are oversight, transparency, having a human at some point in the loop. All right, so let me open this up to the audience if we have any questions here. Okay, yes? I'll repeat your question.
Okay.
So.
A question for Mr. Conti. It is good to have, I agree that it's good to have humans at least some step in the process. But having been a lawyer or a trial lawyer for a long time and doing some other careers, human corruption is a serious issue too. So how do you have any thoughts on how to sort of balance that? How to because if you have human oversight, you also have the potential for corruption.
Well, I mean, you're embodying the law in computer code, right? You're embodying the law in computer code. If that is publicly available computer code, then if it's a closed system and you don't get to look inside, then that's a problem. And I think it's job security for a lot of trial lawyers to pick apart these systems, and over time it'll be refined and modified. I am concerned that if sunlight doesn't reach this code, that you could have who knows what going on, including our programmer that said she would program in a backdoor for herself so you'd never get a speeding ticket.
So this is a really terrific paper, and I want to congratulate you for it. But two observations. The first is it really reminded me of a comment by the late Grant Gilmore, who said that hell is a place where the rules of civil procedure are meticulously obeyed.
Yeah, right.
And here's the second. In a sense, having thought about it, I mean, the paper is really great because it made me think about this. I would never thought about it before the paper, but having thought about it, in a way I'm not surprised at the outcome because you picked a really difficult problem. Speeding is a really difficult problem. And the question the paper made me think about is, what are problems that would be much less difficult to which this sort of thing might apply? And I would invite you to turn your attention to it. I'm even going to give you one suggestion as to the kind of thing, because it has a less temporal, continual piece to it, and that's tax evasion. So it seems to me that it's possible to imagine a world in which we just load up 100% of the transactions on the grid into the database, right? Leontief would be so happy. And now we can compute everybody's tax bill, what it should have been. And we compare it to what they paid. Leave aside the question why we don't just send them a bill, to which the answer is TurboTax won't let us, right? They lobby against that. But okay, so at least in large areas of tax law that are transactions-based as opposed to making judgments about valuations, perhaps.
Right.
And even perhaps there, we can at least create bands of, what we, based on comparables for lots of things. It would seem to me tax law would be one candidate, and there must be others, which would be much better candidates than the very hard problem you picked, for all the reasons you've now explained to us. So what are the good ones?
Well, first, let me say, when we chose this, we specifically chose it because we thought it was easy. The speed limit is only X miles an hour, and we're like, surely this isn't going to be a problem. But part of it is we were pulling the string. We're trying to expand and get at this. And I think the idea of tax cut, it was brilliant. We hadn't considered that beforehand.
Actually, I've got a specific answer. I wrote a paper recently about how a lot of financial contracts these days, things like derivatives contracts and equity options contracts, are completely, I call them data-oriented, implemented in computer-understandable form, where they're able to measure the value of the contract, and then if the event happens, move money from pot A to pot B, thereby fulfilling the contract. So it's not every contract obviously is amenable to that, but some small subset of contracts involving things with distinct metrics and social values are not at stake that are extremely important is one area.
And Michael, I think you've actually identified a very good entire area of study, which is trying to locate various, because, I mean, clearly all transactions wouldn't make it because, for example, is your home office, did you buy this for work? I don't know. I mean, I use it 30% of the time, 40%, so that wouldn't work. But there are areas that you could, and so I would welcome anyone's feedback.
Can I just add one point? I mean, even if we can't always find give you a bill for your tax, we might flag areas for examiners.
Right.
So this could be a two-step.
Yeah, that's actually, and maybe we should actually build that in the paper, the idea of if you could build in levels of at least notifications. Oh, well, we've noticed you've done this, perhaps,
Short of punishment.
Right, exactly.
Or even formal sanction.
Right, notifications, perhaps, instead of automated enforcement. Just, we've noticed that you've sped 15 times in the past 10 minutes. You probably will get a ticket if someone catches you. So maybe that's an option as well.
And I would say, just as we thought driving over the speed limit was easy, trying to do what we're talking about, tax evasion, is probably a little harder than we at first brush. Plus, just generally concerned about the hyper-empowered, frictionless IRS just makes me edgy.
So I heard sort of the discussion of why we wouldn't want to live in the Skinner box, right? And the shocks go off on a regular basis or irregular basis. And it made me think of the flip side, or that same problem expressed from the other direction, which is the degree to which this kind of automation has the effect of delegitimating law as law, that it removes the legitimacy of it as law that one is supposed to psychologically internalize and treat as a normative obligation apart from anything else, and does, as we've done in things like parking tickets and things like that, that it just becomes basically a fee which you decide to pay or not pay. And there are areas in which I think we're kind of okay with that idea, and there are a lot of areas in which we're not. And the question of whether there's something about the nature of this automation that turns it into the Skinner box, that the Skinner box, because of the fact that it's purely behavioral, has the effect of removing the psychological aspect of the legitimacy of law that I think is actually really quite crucial overall. And maybe it's okay for some areas and not for others, but if one were to pursue this across. And then I guess well, let me leave it there, actually. So it's really this question about the delegitimation of law as law. I think we both agree. And John Nelson wrote up, our co-author, handled the section in this paper, has a couple of pages on this, and the same in the first version, where, I mean, we agree. I mean, the law, when you get into the philosophy underlying its existence,
right,
it has to be embraced by the citizenry it seeks to protect, right? I mean,
and maybe there are distinctions to be drawn. So with driving, you've got physical harm, right? I mean, you can smash into someone else, someone can die. Parking, maybe it's less, maybe we're okay with delegitimizing the law there because we really just want to discourage people from parking on the curb. And maybe that's fine until someone parks in front of a fire hydrant and a building burns down.
Or I'm the billionaire who decides to park in this place and simply, so it becomes an equality question.
Right, that's good.
Yeah, and there's a scale of these things that you can see kind of ratcheting up as needed.
I think there's a lot more work to be done, and that's a crucial part of it.
So for those of us who work in computer security and operating systems and network security, there's never been any other kind of enforcement but this, really, to a large extent. I mean, everything's worked this way, and I don't know how much you examined the lessons from that field. But the one issue I thought I'd bring up with you is, because it's probably the one that more people in the world have encountered than any other, is YouTube's Content ID, which is an automated, a little bit of a taxonomy here. You're really talking about automated detection of violation rather than automated enforcement or actual physical compliance, and Content ID actually, at least temporarily, takes down the material. So any lessons from how that's worked? I mean, we've all seen the places where it fails, although it seems that it's placated of a large industry and kept them off of Google's backs, and so they keep doing it. So.
Well, it's outside the law, right? I mean, this is a compliance tool that YouTube uses.
It's copyright law, which is a tort, of course. But
well, okay, I'm a computer scientist in front of a group of lawyers, so I'll try. Let me rephrase that. It's a tool that YouTube uses to examine content to make sure it's not infringing copyright. That's the basic idea of this, and it's a tool they use. It's a defensive. It's a policy compliance tool that they use. To ensure, and that's because they can't look at every single video, so they do like signature.
It's also a monetization tool in the sense that one of the options the copyright holders have is to say allow the content to play and pay us the revenue from it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant. They probably made billions off that just decision alone.
But there has been a cost to, for example, fair use of works, right? I mean, don't works get taken down all the time, which would certainly be fair use, at least arguably.
Even authors. I mean, we've heard the horror stories. I'm not an expert in this. I don't think either one of us are, but we've heard the horror stories of Artist X tried to post their own.
I'll give you a far better one. So I was working at Google, and the head of the team did a TED Talk, and I took the video that he showed in the TED Talk, produced by Google, uploaded it to YouTube, and it said, "No, we've taken this down. It's copyrighted by TED."
So this was Google on Google's own website, shutting down a Google employee uploading. Right. Anyway. Yes.
And that's a cost. I mean, that is undoubtedly a cost of that kind of enforcement that's, I mean, gets into value judgments, policy judgments that we have to make.
And that gets into people are trying to, second guess to work around that. I mean, there are people trying to work around that for their own advantage. I'm sorry.
I'd say one lesson, too, that we can learn from the content ID is you want to make the appeal process as costless as the takedown process. Right. There has to be symmetry in order that the mistakes that happen can be easily corrected. And that initially was not the case, but I think Google has gotten better.
And let me go further, since I'm not working for Google right now, and say that what about the opposite, which is punishment for overuse of the takedown process? And we've seen that in the DMCA. We have sued people, not Google, this is another we, my EFF hat. We have sued people for misuse of DMCA takedowns and gotten punishments on them. What about punishing the people who misuse the computerized law?
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
At a minimum, transparency about abuse. I think we're taking questions at this point from the microphones, so those who want to ask questions, please go up there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back to the point that Kenneth Anderson was making before about the sense in which one can understand perfect enforcement as delegitimizing what the law is about in those contexts through that kind of approach to enforcement. And I think in a sense, one of the things we could do is sort of tease that out a little bit more, because the sense in which we might talk about delegitimizing in broader contexts about robots and when are we going to delegate certain tasks to automated systems, there's a sort of corollary set of questions about dehumanizing. But in the context of what we're talking about, I just wanted to sort of lend a theoretical lens to this that might be useful in thinking about it. And it is a famous discussion by Herbert Hart, the British legal positivist and theorist who wrote the famous book, The Concept of Law, in the mid-60s, I think. And he used as his paradigm example for thinking about the nature of law. And at the time, what he was trying to do was juxtapose two perspectives on the law, what he called an internal perspective of the law and an external perspective. So the person who takes the external perspective is someone who just looks as though they're from outside of the lens of the community and makes observations and makes predictions. So he imagines somebody who takes the external point of view coming upon seeing somebody and a light turning red and then the car stops. And so he says from an external point of view, what we would say about that is that the red light is a sign to stop. And that sign gives rise to a good prediction that most cars will stop. But he says someone who adopts the internal perspective of the law does something much more than that. They see the red light as a signal for stopping. In other words, it provides a reason for stopping, and it's part of a broader human undertaking of a normative set of commitments, of which the red light rule within a legal system is one. And so I think that that's really important. I've thought about this through other lenses. The similar lens in thinking about this for legal theory would be, of course, Holmes's Bad Man, who also uses prediction as the basis for understanding what rules to follow and what rules not to follow. And so without getting into a diatribe on that, I just thought it was useful to sort of think about this from that lens, because I think that's maybe a kind of theoretical hook to grasp on in terms of thinking about what's really going on there when we automate to the level of perfect enforcement. I think that might be one way of explaining why it's problematic or why it might be delegitimizing in a sense. And just I'll leave this as a teaser for those who are interested in it. In looking at some of the discussions on Twitter around this conference, I saw a quick exchange, maybe it was a couple days ago, between Ryan Kalo and Jonathan Zittrain on a different technology, but it was a technology that involves professors being replaced by grading systems, right? And I think that that was the debate that was going on, where Jonathan Zittrain was saying something like that in his view, the idea of writing is about writing to an audience and something. So I thought there's some interesting ways to draw some of these discussions together around the point of automation and its effects. And I think that that relates to some of the effects that you guys are trying to point out and problematize in your work.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
What have your conversations been with actual law enforcement officials? I know here in California, specifically the California Highway Patrol is really trying to embrace technology, but they're not just balancing enforcement in the sense that we think their sole purpose is to give us speeding tickets, it's also the safety of the officers. So what has that focus been in your study, or do you plan to focus on that in the future? I would think that they would be a core part of the collaborative process to create standards in this space.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. And I haven't spoken with law enforcement officers, but I have spoken with judges and other people kind of in the loop to try to determine, we were trying to determine what an accurate grace period might be, for example. And we intuitively sensed that it was about 5 or 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, and we were able to confirm that. And I think that they would be an essential part, mainly because it's possible for us to try to break down automated enforcement at the community level where norms vary. And so it's possible that what works on the interstate in Los Angeles might be different than what works in rural Alabama, for example. And so my instinct would be you couldn't engage in this endeavor without bringing them into the loop.
Yeah, their jobs are on the line, frankly. I mean, by some of these automated systems.
Are you suggesting that we give cops control over their knobs? Let them decide what sort of enforcement to dial in that?
God.
I mean, isn't that what they do right now? At least to a certain degree. And so, and so maybe you have parameters, right? And so you could make the decision to kind of wall this off. You've got discretion within, a certain defined field, perhaps. And above that, we're not going to let you. We're not going to let you do it.
As you look into the camera and there's a human being, you think there's a human being you're pleading with.
Right. Yeah,
and so turn the knob down. Yeah.
In addition to officers, I think that it's important to bring the community itself in. A lot of the rage against red light cameras happens very much at the citizen level, where they're sick of it.
I just can't help but think of this in terms of a ratio, right? As you head toward perfect enforcement, where everything you do is the 1-to-1. You do something wrong, smack. You do something wrong, smack. Right now, it's probably 1 over 100,000 or something, depending. I mean, it's not necessarily. We do lots and lots of things that we could get smacked for, small things typically, and that's decreasing.
Are you suggesting that it's important to keep the historical ratio constant even as we move to technological systems? Preserve that ratio?
Perhaps. I know 1-to-1 is bad.
Right.
Yes,
or just modify slowly. I mean, from this ground-up example. And one thing that might be worth exploring is trying to figure out which laws were passed with the expectation that it would be enforced rigidly, like
micropayments. One of the students suggested micropayments per sample, rather than we'd have these big, giant lump one sample fines, $200, 10 points, and your insurance goes up 10%. So maybe we need micropayments.
I think instead of a speedometer, you should have a dollar on there.
Yeah, you owe no dollars. You are driving at no dollar speed right now, right?
And make no mistake, I mean, there's business models underlying the uses of these systems in various communities.
When hearing this discussion, it reminds me of what goes on in my community as far as garbage collection. If you put out a brown bin, that's your garbage. You put that out once a week. But your recyclables are staggered every other week, and with compost. So in my community, the recycle bin is blue and the compost bin is green. Now, if you put out your blue bin when you're supposed to have put out your green bin, it's not going to be picked up. And it seems like everybody accepts that. I don't hear anybody complaining about that. However, the complaints are very bitter as to those automated red lights.
And so I think that gives us some insight into which kind of laws maybe we're okay with perfectly enforcing. And so, if you miss your recycling, not so bad. And we've got an efficient, maybe pickup system, and maybe that forces people to get in line. The example that we tend to use is, it's one thing to try to enforce speeding perfectly, which, we debate as to whether that's wise or not, but I don't think anyone would want jaywalking enforced perfectly, right? I mean, restrictions on that, everyone would think that's ridiculous.
Well, the thing about enforcing a speed limit
that you're either speeding or not speeding implies a step function. And that's not the way cars work. That's not the way the control of cars work. That's not the way people work. And so
That's how code works, though.
yeah. So there's actually some other mathematical function that represents you seeing 50 mile an hour and then you slow down to 35 or something. It's not a step function at all. So I don't see how it could be either you're speeding or not speeding. I mean, anyway. Right.
No, and I think that that's some of these groups that we've kicked around and proposed. I mean, maybe that's what we visit, and we have an organization that says, automation speeding is possible, just not with the law that we've got right now.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Well, I'm listening to this discussion and I'm thinking, well, these aren't really laws. We're trying to take something that's a guideline, because that's how it's treated, and say, well, let's make it into an algorithm. I mean, aren't we talking about writing different kinds of laws if we're going to enforce this? I mean, we have laws that we mean, and then there are laws that we kind of mean as a metaphor.
Right.
But bureaucracies don't understand that sometimes when they put that in the code. Right?
Well, and it's true. I mean, there's law on the books, and then there's law on the ground, and everyone tends to. I mean, we can drive 5-10 miles an hour with the speed limit. We feel reasonably sure that we're not going to get a ticket. But if you were pulled over for going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, you're on the hook, right? And so it's this implied understanding that we lose when things become automated, and perhaps the answer to that is redrafting the law, right? Or adding in the machine version of that law that gets at the same thing. But that's a discussion that has to be had over time, and you have to have rulemaking authority to do it, I would argue.
So please join me in thanking our panelists for a very interesting discussion here.